Hello and welcome to Dystopian Review, the place where we dream of nightmare worlds. I'm your host, Jesse Pullman, and today we're going to take a look at an event that we Americans view mainly through the eyes of the seizure of one of our embassies by angry, radicalized men in the Middle East who wanted to create an Islamic state. But we're not talking about Benghazi. We're talking about the Iranian Revolution, and we're going to use Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis as a beautiful visual analog of events that happened throughout her life and how she managed to make it through a war, a revolution, a trip abroad to grow up in free Europe, and how it felt for her to return as an adult to a place that she left, and a place that was very changed. Without further ado, cue the theme song. One of the main reasons I find Persepolis to be so fascinating is that it doesn't just tell the story of a group of young, maybe disenfranchised Islamic radicals taking control of a country and then oppressing all the women and kicking all those who don't believe out if they're lucky. We're not talking about the so-called Islamic State in Iraq. No, we're not talking about ISIS, friends. Instead, what you get is a much more nuanced look at how this revolution developed through the eyes of the author, Marjane Satrapi, when she was a child and when she was an adult. You will see cases of these so-called oppressed women turning around and oppressing others. You will see just how basic human rights have been ignored in Iran, but how also outside influence hasn't helped. And most of all, you're going to get a little information about the country that most Americans don't consider. I mean, any idiot can read a Wikipedia page and get some of this stuff, but it's not explained very well, certainly not in a high school class, which might talk about the seizure of the embassy briefly before deciding to just tell us how it affected Carter and not how it affected, Iran itself. And it certainly doesn't go into details about one of my favorite historical tragic figures, Mohammad Mossadegh. Even in the early introduction, Satrapi makes a point of talking about early Iranian history. It talks about the Persian Empire, and don't forget, Iran is the child of Persia. It talks about Reza Shah deciding to westernize and modernize the country, which I totally said backwards because you're looking at this on a screen. On the second page, however, it mentions one of my favorites. Mohammad Mossadegh was the Prime Minister of Iran, and he nationalized the oil industry. In retaliation, Great Britain organized an embargo on all exports of oil from Iran. In 1953, the CIA and the British intelligence officers organized a coup against him. He was overthrown, and the Shah came to power. Now, at this point, any serious student of history would say that the Shah wasn't that terrible. That terrible being a stretch of a term. Yes, he had a secret police, the Savak. Yes, he sort of kept a lot of the profits from the oil industry that, Britain and America wanted him to run. No, he wasn't really the most gentle person, but he also wasn't up against an honest and fair opponent. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who most Americans hear and think of as a religious Nazi, he lied to his followers and his allies about what his true goals for the country were in the first place. More to the point, well, let's just say that the more the Shah, backed off of aggressive police policies, the more that the political opposition was able to get away with lies about body counts and able to undermine his attempts to make change. I'm not trying to say the man wasn't a dictator. He was. And I'm not trying to say the U.S. didn't put a dictator in charge of that country when a democratically elected person seemed like he might socialize it. We did. We did that a lot in the 50s. We did that with Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, for starters, at the behest of the United Fruit Company. Now I believe it's called, what's that lady who dances? Chiquita Bananas. Been buying governments off since the 50s. My point is, we had a hand in this. Never forget that we had a hand in this, and that once the Iranian Revolution in 1979 comes around, a lot of them blame us for the bloodshed on their streets by not only the Shah, but also by Khomeini. Satrapi's use of visual illustrations to explain just what happened in Iran's history comes first of all on page 44, where she discusses how first their own emperors ruled them, then an Arab invasion came, then the Mongolians came, and finally the modern imperialists. And you'll notice the last of those two guys in the bottom right are British Man and Uncle Sam. Now, there are numerous scenes about how the revolution was fought, about tragedies that took place, such as the Great Cinema Fire, which killed 400 people. It was actually known as one of the largest terror attacks in history until September 11th happened in 2001. But I'm going to skip over that because, as important as it is, most Americans just don't go that deep into things. We like to think of the big moments that affect us, and less of the day-in, day-out grind of a revolution that we didn't really hear about anyway. A lot of information at the time was heavily censored, after all. I want to focus on that embassy seizure. And while Marjane at the time was still just a child, she does have her father's insight and mentality on exactly what happened there. So, just take a moment and look at this scene. It's kind of ridiculous in a way because the father says, "Oh shit," and the wife says, "I don't care." And Marjane's thoughts are for, not being able to go see her friend. Maybe deep in the back of my mind they realized this could be a problem, but at the time it was just like, oh, you know what, these people are crazy, and the Americans, well, they're idiots anyway. So who cares, right? I mean, nobody's going to care about that, but, maybe the students, right? I'd just like quickly to reacquaint you with my little baby Arielle. I need to do this because, in a way, this sort of revolution, it hits home a little. America had a revolution once, and we're very lucky we didn't end up like this. And there's all this talk about other countries going through revolutions where Islamic leaders are taking charge. So it's worth taking a moment to really consider the impact that this kind of circumstance would have on the life of somebody, especially somebody young, growing up to face these kind of hazards. I mean, look at places like Iraq, where you have ISIS, and all of these insane terrorist ideas like suicide bombings. That was a real issue for Iran during the revolution. The idea that their territory was so weak that Iraq felt like it could invade and get away with it. And we're not going to talk about Iran-Contra or Saddam Hussein getting a little cover fire from the Reagan administration. No. We're going to focus on the facts here. And the facts are, well, the facts are that all of those horrible things happened, but the focus should be on what happened to the young people during this war during the Revolution and the almost inevitable Iraq-Iran war. You know, that war before I cut myself off that we like to forget we were ever involved in. We meet Miss Narcine, who is the family's maid. She's upset because they gave her child what they call the keys to paradise. It's a plastic key painted gold. But the boys that go to war and are lucky enough to die will get into heaven because of this. She talks about how they tell him there will be plenty of food, women, and houses made of gold and diamond. When Miss Narcine is asked specifically about women, you get an answer that most comedians have come up with already. Well, he's 14 years old. That's exciting. Marjane turns around and asks her cousin Payman, "Did they give you the keys to paradise?" And he says, "Keys to what?" Because they're not a poor family. And the keys to paradise were for poor people. Thousands of young kids promised a better life exploded on the minefields with their keys around their necks. Miss Narcine's son managed to avoid that fate, but lots of other kids from his neighborhood didn't. Meanwhile, Satrapi got to go on her first party, and not only did the mom let her go, she also knitted her a sweater full of holes and made a necklace with chains and nails. Punk rock was in, and she was looking sharp. One of the most anti-war bands that I know of is System of a Down, and one of my favorite songs by them is BYOB. I'm not going to get into the whole thing or try to play the whole song, but I will just give you one line that they consistently repeat. Why do they always send the poor? It's a good question, and it's not something that Iran alone dealt with. And it's not just the poor, it's the disadvantaged. The weakest members of society get sent first, while the most privileged get to go on living their lives as best they can. A bad example, perhaps, is the Hitler Youth. And during the invasion of Germany, and especially the Battle of Berlin near the end of the war in Europe, these children, and they were young, were heavily indoctrinated and asked to give their lives to take Allied lives without really being promised a hope of victory. They were just told, it's time to die. And many of them went along with it. It's kind of sad. And it's the one occasion where you might actually feel bad for somebody who wears a swastika into battle and dies. Because when you're a child, even if you fanatically believe in what you're being told, and that goes for people that believe that there are 72 virgins waiting for them in the afterlife and that blow themselves up and kill innocent people, when they're children, when they've been lied to, it's hard to say it's their fault. They don't know anything else, and they're certainly not given another choice, because if they don't do it, they'll be killed anyway. And many of them believe it's their only hope. I don't want to get too preachy about this, and as time goes on, it stops becoming a decision forced upon them and becomes a decision they willingly embrace. But you have to remember to humanize your enemy. It was one of the big traits that, the big lessons I should say, that Robert McNamara learned in his career as Secretary of Defense and an all-around leader of the American military. Think what you'd like of him. You have to empathize with your enemy. And if people are desperate enough that they allow their 14-year-old children to go off and die on the promise of an afterlife backed up by a plastic key, I think there are problems with just trying to paint them as horribly evil people. That's all I'm trying to say. Back in Marjane's life, she gets in trouble for taking her punk music too far. A few of the moral police, the Women's League of Moral Police, I guess you could say, they catch her wearing her Michael Jackson pins, and they very nearly take her to what amounts to prison over them. How would you like that? It's not just the fashion police, it's the fashion police that are gonna take you to jail. Now, Satrapi might be the hero of our story, but as a lens to the Iranian Revolution, the time she spends outside of the country is not as relevant to the story. I'm not saying that we don't care or that you shouldn't care. In fact, as an Iranian who has been through the revolution and has an inherent resistance to the indoctrination of the regime, to see her go abroad and have to try to live in a capitalistic society which doesn't seem to really give a damn about stuff like religious freedom sometimes, or certainly economic freedom. They take it so for granted. That's incredible. Like, how does this person go from one completely different lifestyle to everything she ever idolized gone 10,000 times too far? It's worth a read. But I'm going to skip it because there's one scene where our hero does something not heroic. It's something that just about everyone living in a dystopian environment would do. Don't get me wrong. And it's something that Marjane, after her return to Iran, learned very quickly was the wrong thing to do. But it really deserves a mention because it's exactly the sort of thing we see in 1984, and it's exactly the sort of thing that really a lot of people would do if they had to in order to survive. In this final scene that we'll look at, Marjane gets caught having been waiting for her boyfriend in makeup by the moral police. She looks to a man who happens to be sitting nearby and cries out that he said something inappropriate to her, also that they might not notice her indiscretions. The man was innocent and was in fact taken away. And Marjane, well, she got yelled at by her grandmother, who reminded her that not only had she suffered, but her family had suffered at the hands of these sort of people, and that to suddenly become a tattletale to save her own skin, and to do it all so that she could enjoy something as simple as makeup, that was selfish, and it was a mistake Marjane learned from so much that she included it in her book when she could have easily just left that little story out. And that really just about sums up Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. It's a great book. It has little flaws. It could be a little better explained, but overall it really gives a context to Iranian society that most Americans simply lack. We like to think of Iran as a country that hates us, that goes out in the streets and protests us, and maybe that has happened. Maybe, if you look back as far as Mossadegh, maybe we've given them a little reason to be mad at us. Just a little one. Certainly not a reason to want to kill us, but then again, we did try to control their country for some time, and did in fact support a dictator. Maybe we can learn not to do that. In the meantime, our situation with Iran is precarious. Their former president, a man named Ahmadinejad, was a lunatic who denied the Holocaust. He was crazy. Now, I believe their president's name is Rouhani. And there's certainly a movement that wants peace with us in Iran. They want to end this stalemate. There's some windows that would be better to use for that than others. I mean, there's talk about us allying with them against ISIS in Iraq, but that would be a problem. Instead, we need to focus on eliminating at least this nuclear proliferation issue so that we can get to the business of letting Iran build up as a country and develop more tolerant and better educated people. Educated people don't put up with nonsensical dictatorships. Okay, so maybe Iran does have a decent education system already, and I don't know. I'm not there. What I do know is that I'm a little bit out of my depth. We have plenty of new content being planned here, but for now, it's been a long enough time. I think it's time to sign off. So once again, this is Dystopian Review. I'm your host, Jesse Pullman, and I'd like to give special thanks to Ariella Wheeler for a little help with some of the pictures taken out of the book. She did an excellent job in getting our images set up. And with that in mind, I have some reviews planned, and I also have some other stuff up my sleeve. So this has been Dystopian Review, always dreaming of nightmare worlds. Oh, hey, now that you're done with the episode, why don't you go back and check out my favorite book and my favorite dystopian review before this one on Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake. Or if you prefer, you can click this magic koosh ball once I have a new post up, and it will try to take you there. Enjoy!